You're listening to ViewSource, a conversation around tech, web development, and WordPress with hosts Aurooba Ahmed, that's me, and Brian Quartz. Hello.
How are we doing today?
Pretty good. What about you?
I'm good. I just have this burning question I got to ask you at the top of the episode. Are you ready?
Yeah, always. Never, but
Okay.
always.
Okay. In your time machine, go back in time, I think it's 6-7 years now. The great leader gives his commandment from on high. Thus spoke Matt Mullenweg, learn JavaScript deeply. Did you, in that moment, do you remember that? Learn JavaScript deeply.
Yes.
It's classic WordPress history, it's like a seminal moment. How did you react? Did you learn it? Did you already know it? Did you get it? Like, what was your thoughts when that became the thing?
My thought was, oh my God, what is he about to do? And two, he's about to do something. I better go learn JavaScript. So I bought the JavaScript course from Wes Boss and then didn't touch it for like a year.
Yeah. I would love to see Wes Boss's sales after that learn JavaScript deeply.
Yes.
It's like he probably got so many sales, and like how many of those people made it like 20% through one of his courses? Which one, the React one, or did you make the fish market or whatever?
Yes, I made the fish market. The React one, I definitely got it. Because I think when he talked about JavaScript deeply, I forget what it was called. What was the name of the experiment they ran in WordPress.com for the new UI? Calypso, yeah. So I remember seeing Calypso. I'm like, okay, are they thinking they're going to bring something like that to core? Oh, this is built in React. Okay, maybe it's going to be React. So yeah, I bought the course, didn't go through it until much, much later. But yeah, I wonder if Wes was like, what is happening? Why is this happening?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you and I have talked about the fact that there actually is not a great like WordPress JavaScript-y course that I don't have one in my mind when people ask like, oh, I want to learn JavaScript for WordPress. I don't have that in my head of where I would send them, other than, Wes's React courses is a good, a great place if you don't know React, for sure.
Yeah, and his vanilla JavaScript, the free one, is also really, really good.
That the 30-day where you do a little thing every day, that one is great. That should be like, if you're kind of unsure about JavaScript, or like you just have a little bit of, you should do that like once a year or something. Like it's just a fun little like 30-day challenge. Don't eat carbs and do 30 days of JavaScript.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun actually, and I learned a lot when I first went through it. There were like random things that were like, oh, okay, I didn't even know you could do that, or okay, that's how they do that. Little moments. Yeah, but today we're going to talk about React, because that's the thing in WordPress, and how React actually works. And hopefully this is going to be a series where we start from like really, really basic and build what you called on Twitter like the to-do list version of WordPress blocks.
I was like, what did I say on Twitter? Yes, the accordion block in WordPress, the thing that every site needs an accordion block. There's not one in core. I don't want a giant plugin pack of 50, bazillion blocks. You got to build it yourself. Everyone has to build their accordion block at least once.
Yes.
It is the to-do list app of WordPress development, for sure.
Yes, in the JavaScript world that we find ourselves in now. Yeah, so, we will build one over a course of a few different episodes. But before we actually build an accordion block, we actually have to understand a little bit of React. Like, what is React? So, what is React, Brian?
This is my how I explain React in like beginner terms or something, the metaphor that I use, which is I think when I explain React, I think about Facebook, the company that owns React or like created React. I think about how Facebook is sort of a user interface that everybody's pretty familiar with, social media network, like social networks in general. So you have like a giant column of like latest feed information, and you have like little avatars of people, and you have some notifications. And what React is React is a way to say like, when I'm looking at all this stuff on a website, I want it to all be controlled in like one dynamic place. And I want like all of those little components, the feeds, the posts, the things, I want them to be as like performant and reusable and connected as possible. And that was like super hard in the old days of kind of vanilla JavaScript and jQuery. But what React does is it basically says like, oh, this is a component. This is your component of messages. And when you read a message, the other component that says how many unread messages you have will automatically update and react to the fact that you read this message over here somewhere else in your thing. And this component will be here and it'll be reusable and all this sort of stuff. And it's like the way to put all of that in one mental model and make it super interactive, like an app. Is that how close am I to your like vision of what React is?
That's very accurate to how I would describe it. Essentially, it's got a really good name. It tries to react to user interaction, and the way that it does that is React actually builds a sort of virtual DOM. So DOM being like your whole document in the browser, and it will build a React version of it, and then it will track the comparison of what's happening in there versus what's actually happening in the HTML in the actual DOM. So when you click something in the browser, it's going to say, "Oh, this click, I don't have that tracked in my, shadow DOM. Okay, I need to update that." And then based on what React, what you have programmed, it's going to be like, okay, we need to add this into the HTML. So we'll update the shadow DOM with what's supposed to happen. And that will, compare to where the differences are in the HTML, and then it'll interact there. So it's doing a lot of injection and things that are
Mm-hmm.
happening behind the scenes so that you don't have to do that manually, like with vanilla JavaScript. That's the
Yeah, and
basic
like
core of React.
yeah, and I feel like it was the first time where it flipped it. Like the old jQuery days was like store everything in your HTML as like a little data attribute. Like HTML nodes were just like getting packed full of data, and you always had to update them and check them and like
Yeah.
shift them around and stuff. And React was like, no, no, no. Like we will handle all of the thinking, and then we'll make the HTML after. And like it's sort of like, it's sort of moving the source of truth and information kind of away and like keeping it in a nice safe place where it can like feed little information down through all your little components.
Yeah, exactly. And just like PHP, where you kind of have your uh, render, like your output and your logic mixed together. But when you're writing a PHP like document, you can say, oh, all of my logic actually lives here at the top and all of my HTML lives at the bottom. React, especially the way if you use JSX, works kind of the same way, where you can like have your logic kind of near the top of a function, and then that function it returns the HTML, and that's where all of your
Mm-hmm.
like anything that's going to happen in the browser actually is written. So there are similarities with like how PHP works and the way React works in JSX, which is really helpful if you're coming from the WordPress world where you might have been kind of thinking like that a little bit.
Yeah, like, React is like a very component based. So, like a component for this, and then inside of your component, there's little components for this, and they're very
Yeah.
reusable. And if you built WordPress themes and you've used like template parts, I feel like that's kind of a good way to think about it. It's like you get your little template part and it kind of
Yeah.
gets some stuff from like the global loop and it populates it in,
Hmm.
but it's a reusable component. If you've used a lot of template parts in your theme building, like that mental
Yeah.
model of like, breaking things into little components and passing information down through them is very similar,
Yeah.
except like also it's like very reactive and live and, does
Yeah.
does like a million magical like things without reloading the whole page.
Exactly. So I'm going to share my screen and let's take a look at kind of what we're going to walk through today. So first of all, if the browser looks crazy, it's because I'm testing out the new Arc browser, which doesn't have any like extra URL Chrome or anything like that. So it is a browser. I know it doesn't look like one.
Yeah. You're braver than me for like changing your I'm like my browser is like where I spend like 80% of my waking hours and I'm afraid to mess with it or to take such a radical departure.
I get it. I'm between browsers right now, I guess you could say. Okay, so on my screen I've got just a child theme of 2023 in WordPress, and there's a post and I've called it building an accordion because over time you're going to build an accordion right here. But underneath it there is a button and it says hello, and if I were to click on it, underneath it you see the
Ooh.
world text appear. So it
That's
says
a nice
hello world.
touch.
Yeah. So this is React. This is built completely in React. And honestly, you could also do this with regular JavaScript, but it's just a little bit easier to read and maybe a little easier to understand it in React once you get past how to get React onto the page, which is like a whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, the scary thing with React is like, I need to install a bajillion dependencies and like, I need to make a big like build process and compile things and all this sort of stuff. And even like if you've ever used like vue.js where you kind of can skip all that and you can get up and running with just like including it on the page, which is crazy. That I think is what's maybe is like the first thing people are like, yeah, you say it's just JavaScript, but like I know I got to do like a bunch of stuff. I know there's like a process. I can't just write my
Yeah,
React.
that's true. The nice thing about WordPress is that we have this package that the core maintains called WordPress scripts. And WordPress scripts takes care of a lot of this because of the fact that WordPress packages React into every WordPress instance. So React is available. You just have to start using it. And if you use the WordPress scripts, build package that they have, then it takes care of a lot of that stuff with magic, which is really nice. So should I share my screen? Let's go through the code.
Let's look at this code. I mean, when I look at the front, I'm like, okay, you got a button and you have some text and you click the button and the text appears and disappears. Like
Yes.
how many lines of code will this take is what I want to know.
Okay, so I've got my code editor open now and it's showing up on the screen. And the very first thing we're looking at is the index.js file. And this file is 15 lines long. But really, the code part is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 lines of code here, of which really 1, 2, 3, 4 lines are required in order to put React on your page in WordPress.
And so when you decided to put this index.js file, you stuck it in like a source folder and stuff like that. And the idea here is like, if I'm using WordPress's build process, it's going to do all of these things like the imports. There's like import this from this and import app from this. And it's going to do all of that for me. And I don't even
Yeah.
need to think about it.
Yeah, you don't have to think about it. Like the WordPress element, which is the first package that I'm importing from, is basically how WordPress packages React into WordPress. The reasoning for this is in case they ever want to switch out of React in underneath behind the scenes, they can do that without you having to rewrite every single thing that you've ever written. But really, for now, because it is React, we can say that WordPress element is React. So you're importing from React.
So I'm importing from React, but like big picture, how do you keep track of like, I'm using React, I'm using vanilla JavaScript, and I'm using WordPress's very specific flavor of React? Or do you just not really think about that right now because you're just like, I'm in WordPress. That's the most important thing to focus on.
So I think this is something that a lot of people trip over when they're first getting into like WordPress block development, especially because yeah, it's really hard to know what is React, what is WordPress React, and what is like the WordPress block stuff. Everything that's inside Element for the most part is straight up React from this package. It's just React stuff that is being pulled in. It's not all of React, but it's most of what you might need from React, those base things that React does, and it allows you to pull from them. And today, what we're going to be looking at is just React. We're not looking at anything WordPressy flavored. We're not looking at, what the WordPress block API does in React. All of that comes later. And it's a lot like when people do PHP dev for the first time for WordPress and they only know WordPress PHP. They know how PHP works inside
Mm-hmm.
WordPress, but they don't necessarily know WordPress on its own. And
Yeah.
so it's a little bit like that when you start out. But like today, we're going to look at just React. That's it.
So then what is createRoot? The first thing you're doing is you're hitting up WordPress's element, their kind of wrapper around React, and you're importing a function called createRoot. What does
Yes.
createRoot do for us?
Okay, so createRoot, whenever you're using JavaScript, really, and even jQuery, or let's say you were using Ajax in regular WordPress fashion, you need to have a container or an element on the page that you target and say, here is where I want to inject my JavaScript, or here is where I want to create things. Let's say with Ajax, you were like pulling posts dynamically from WordPress. This is the div that I want it to add it to. So that's what the root is. Like this is going to be the element that forms the foundation of where we're adding everything from React. It's the root of our setup.
Okay. So in the build process, it's going to grab that function and kind of like compile it into your JavaScript. So like it pulls in
Yes.
everything you need. It imports this function that's going to like let you create your root of where you're going to kind of like, render out your app and store all your data and all that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yes, exactly. And after that line, I have something called import app. So in React, there's this best practice of having an index.js where you initialize something, but then you don't actually do your work in that file. You put all of that work in a different file. Often it's called app because React is often used to create applications. And so you have to import that into this index.js so you can insert it in the root that you're going to make. Then I'm just importing a style sheet just to add some little styles to make it easy for us to look at. We are on line 12. If you are following along and you have this repo, which we'll have in the show notes, we're creating a constant called DOM node because what we have to do is identify and get the wrapper, the div, where we want to actually insert our app or insert our React stuff. In this case, I'm identifying and looking for a div or an element essentially with an ID vs-accordion-root. And on the front end, I actually just took a group block in WordPress and I gave it the HTML anchor with this so that I can just insert it there.
But like when you make React, like the initial piece of HTML is like, I need a div with an ID. Like is a lot of
Yes.
times what you're looking at. It's like, I need a div, I need an ID, and then I'm just gonna like, that's gonna be the piece of DOM where I'm just gonna like pummel everything into
Inject.
that div.
Yeah,
Yeah. I like pummel. I think
exactly.
pummel's a technical term also.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all used to doing that kind of thing with JavaScript in general, like whether it's jQuery or you're running like Ajax to pull posts from WordPress. It's a very common thing to have a wrapper or some sort of div that's empty, and that's where you put all of your like the JavaScript stuff is going to get added there. Then what you do is now that you found this element, you have to turn it into a place where you can add React. And that's what the createRoot function does. It says, hey, this is going to be the element that I want to transform into my React stuff. And once you've done that, you grab your application that you're importing, and the name I gave it is app. That's the variable for that. And then I just render it. I say, hey, take this and put it into that root that we just created on that VS accordion root wrapper div.
Yeah, and so this right here is like from project to project, like this is pretty much like 80% of the time what you're going to be looking at, right? I mean, like you grab an
Yes.
element, you have an app, you import it, you render it. This part here is like sort of like I'm going to let Copilot write this page for me in the future because it's going to be pretty similar to this,
Yeah,
but the app.js file, like that's where the actual React app that we're building is kind of going to live.
exactly. And
Go
in
ahead.
fact,
Yeah.
I literally just copy pasted this from another project that I have because I was like, I'm not going to write this. What?
Yeah.
And if you give it a verbose command, GitHub Copilot can totally do it for you.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah. So this, I've switched over to the app.js file. And this file is 20 lines long, but there's some spaces and happy comments and a few
Yeah, you don't have
comments
to
here and there.
brag about how long your JavaScript file is.
No, but you did. You talked about it from the beginning. You were like, okay, let's see how many lines of code it takes to build this little button that opens
Yeah.
and closes.
Yeah. I have like 50 things I want to dig into here, but
Yeah.
let's do it line by line because you're right. It's like it's a lot of lines. A lot of this too is like scaffolding stuff, declaring
Yeah.
a function, exporting a function. Like that's the kind of stuff. Like it's a line of code that again, like you're gonna copy paste, Copilot's gonna write. You're gonna do it so many times you do it in your sleep.
Exactly.
But it's what happens in between all those lines where like the magic happens.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip the first line just for a second, the first import that we're doing. We'll come back to that. This whole application is just a function, and then I export this function just like I would maybe in a regular JavaScript file, and then I'm importing it later. In this function, we have a return, and the return area is where we spit out the HTML that we want happening on the front end of our website. So that's where I'm adding my button, and it's also where I have a little conditional that says, hey, when I click that button, show the word world in a paragraph element.
Well, I will say you make it sound like writing a function and exporting it in one JavaScript file and then importing it in your index.js file. Like I will say you make it sound like that's a thing that everybody does all the time. But I would push
Mm.
back a little bit and say like these are the places where I think a lot of people who came from like jQuery and maybe some vanilla JavaScript and they're looking at WordPress and they're looking at blocks and they're looking at the block editor, they're looking at React and they're looking at learn JavaScript deeply. Like that right there, I would bet that a lot of people would probably agree with me and say like, I don't know if that's JavaScript. I don't, that's like
Mm.
whatever is it, ES Next or whatever. Like that's
Yeah.
modern future JavaScript. And like, that's already a little bit of a, so I'm just pushing you on that because I think it's
No, you're right.
some of that stuff is like a little bit like still scary. Like, oh, I can write a function and then I have to export my function from one file and then another file is going to import that function.
That's fair. That's fair. And it's something that in jQuery you often really don't need to do because you just write your function and then you include the file and it just works. You're right.
Yeah.
But yeah, like in a lot of JavaScript and especially in React, if you want to take a file and include its contents in another file, you have to say that this is something I want to use outside of this file. So you have to export it. And so here we've written a function and then we're doing something called export default and then the name of that function, which is also something that can be confusing because this export default is assuming that there's only one function in this whole file that you want to be made usable outside of it. If I had more than one function in this file and I wanted to export those, I would not say export default app. In fact, I would just say export and add that to the beginning of the function name. So it'd
Yeah.
be like export function app. And then I could have multiple functions that I'm exporting. It's a lot like partials in Sass. That's I think like the closest comparison to something that we already do, right? Like you don't have to export, but you do have to import things in Sass where you write a partial and then you import it somewhere. And if you didn't import it, then you can't use it. Like the
Yeah.
variables, for example.
And or another one is like in PHP. Like I love my PHP to be like 50 files instead of one giant file. Like I love tiny little
Yeah.
files with different names. And so, it's a similar thing where you're requiring or including a file in PHP. There's not that like export process, but it's that same thing of like, how can we start breaking things into smaller files? And if you're used to writing like one JavaScript file for your theme and it's like 4,000 lines long and it's like a bunch of jQuery event listeners or whatever, like, hey,
Yeah.
we've all done it. Like that, this is, once you do realize like, oh, I can just write a function and I can export it. And then later when I need it, I can import it. And similarly, WordPress has written tons of JavaScript that they're exporting that we'll get into that, like we did before, we can import it at the top and import that function that you need. You
Yeah.
start seeing like kind of how cool that is and how neat that we can start doing those things with when we build JavaScript.
Yeah, definitely. I think the practice of breaking things into little files instead of doing all of your work in long files is really, really important as you start to do more complex and intense things. And JavaScript, especially block development, is just by default a complex thing, So the more files you have, the cleaner and easier you make your code to read and navigate, the better your future self will just thank you. Your future self will be happy with you.
Yeah.
Okay, so clearly we have a lot more than I thought we would be able to get through in one episode. So I think we should pause here.
Yeah. I think let's stop here. Let's come back. I think there's things we need to like, we still need to talk about this, state management. We need to talk about like JSX and how all that works. We need to talk about all these like weird modern JavaScript things like destructuring and like spreading
Yeah.
arrays and like all those like fancy things that kind of trip people up. So what do you say we do that next week and finish this next week?
Yes. Okay. So stay tuned for part 2 of this first part of the accordion series.
Visit viewsource.fm for the latest updates and links to the show notes. Review and subscribe to ViewSource in iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.